Alrighty, if you could please silence your cell phones right now as to not disrupt our presentation today, that would be great. This lecture series is brought to us in part by a grant from the MS Worthington Foundation, so we're very grateful for that. And I want to introduce today's speaker, Jim Lentowski. Jim Lentowski is the Executive Director of the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, a position that he has held since being hired as the organization's first employee in July 1971. A native of Chicopee, Massachusetts, Jim holds both a bachelor's and a master's degree in landscape architecture from UMass Amherst. Under his tutelage, the foundation's land holdings have grown from 1,200 acres to 9,000 acres, 30% of our little island here. In addition to his on-island interests, Jim's professional activities include an ongoing participation with the Land Trust Alliance and serving as a founding steering committee member of the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition. So everybody please put your hands together and let's give a warm welcome to Jim Lentowski.
Unaccustomed as I am to speaking to small groups, I want to welcome you all here. It's fun to get together in the dead of winter, even though the video that we're producing today will be watched in the heat of the summer months, I'm sure, many, many times. Our subject today has a lot to do with the island which we all share. Not only the good times, but also the not so good times. And what I wanted to do is to remind everybody who I work for and why we all enjoy the natural landscape of the island so much. And we're going to run a commercial first. Sit back and relax for 60 seconds.
Imagine a Nantucket without conservation land. A Nantucket without tranquil forests or unspoiled beaches. Without cranberry bogs or marshes or moors or wetlands. Imagine a Nantucket without sprawling farms, swaying grasslands, without ancient oak trees rising high from the ground. For 50 years, the Nantucket Conservation Foundation has protected Nantucket from this possibility. Today, 9,000 acres remain as they were in the beginning, with all the pristine natural beauty that makes Nantucket a magical world unto itself. The Nantucket of our dreams is here today. Join us in protecting it for generations to come.
That was not Nat Philbrick, that was me.
Imagine a Nantucket without conservation.
We don't want to watch that more than once. Seriously, the foundation founders, the 9 people who got together in 1963 to establish the organization that I've been working for now for 43 years, were dream makers. They never, and having known all of them well, they never anticipated that the organization that they established back then as sort of a trial balloon would ever grow into something as large as it has today. And not only are we talking about foundation properties, but we're also talking about the offshoots of our program that include the Land Bank Commission. When I say offshoot, the idea that was planted of perpetuating the open spaces that we all enjoy, not only during the summer months, but during the winter months when we can go walking in places like the Sanford Farm and the Tuppence Links and Squam Swamp and all these wonderful properties that are available to everybody to enjoy without charge. This is really remarkable when I talk to my colleagues off island and they think about what this organization and what its peer organizations on the island have accomplished, and to think that you can go out walking these properties and not have to be a member of the organization, not have to be supporting us, but just go out to the Sanford Farm every morning and walk your dog, or the Tuppence Links and walk your dog, or go for a run during the middle of the summer months. It really is quite something to behold that the community has been behind this effort for 50-plus years now. It doesn't go without responsibility, and what I'm here to talk about today is something that in the last 3 or 4 years we've spent a great deal of effort working on. And the next video will introduce you to the subject of wildfire management on Nantucket. And I do so humbly because there are many people that have been involved in this effort. Mark McDougall, who is our fire chief, is here today with us. And he is certainly right in the middle of it all. There are folks that have been on Nantucket for a long time, all their lives, who have experienced wildfire in a way that I've never experienced. I've been around and seen some areas of the island in flames in a prescribed fire, but you can imagine the horror that people would have knowing that there was a fire burning out of control on the island and feeling somewhat helpless. Not that we don't have a good fire department, but it has limited capabilities, and the nearest mutual aid that we have for our fire department is at least 3 hours away by boat. So these are some of the issues that we've struggled with as the island's largest property owner. 9,000 acres is about a third of the island. And together with the Land Bank Commission and the other open space landowners, we face very serious issues of how much intervention do we do ahead of time? Do we make our properties more accessible to the firefighters? Do we make our properties safer because we're burning off this accumulated material that's been on the ground since the time that our local fire department has taken very seriously the task of trying to stop a fire from spreading. You can't just light a fire out. I can remember one of the stories that I heard when I first got here, and Bob McGrath was working for the foundation, and he told stories about Matty Jekyll, who was one of our local farmers, who had a farm on the south side of the Prospect Hill Cemetery, where his farmhouse was located. And Matty, in order to make the land better to plant in the spring, would start a fire in his backyard when he had a north wind, and he'd go to town and have lunch and come back, and the fire had burned from his house all the way to the ocean because there was nothing between his house and the ocean. Back in the early days when I first arrived, Tom Larrabee, who's been running our cranberry bogs for a very long time, used to start fires. Red Roundsville would start fires out at the windswept cranberry bog, and they would seemingly go burning out of control. They knew what they were doing because they had done it over and over and over again. But you'd drive by there and say, oh my God, there's a fire, and what are we going to do about it? And Tom Larrabee would say, oh, don't worry about it, it'll burn itself out. And Red Roundsville was the same way. Anyway, those situations we can't tolerate today. The value of properties near our properties, people who built homes that wanted to look out over these protected lands, suddenly they start to come to grips with the issue of, well, what happens if a fire got started out there? And I have a short video, an 8-minute video that I'd like to show you that will explain what it is we're doing. We're going to follow that by a quick 1-minute film that'll show you some of the equipment that we're using, and then I have a bunch of slides I want to share with you. So we could have the video.
Everything was powder dry, and there were signs posted all around town: no open fires, woods and commons are closed. Supposedly, the man tried to get a permit for a charcoal grill on the beach, and he couldn't get one, so he went out in the woods and set up his charcoal grill. And that is what they claim started the fire.
For my parents, it was pretty frightening for them. There was a fire around their house, they had a new family, and I really don't know how long it burned before they got a warning, and they had time. They had a warning to get out and they could get their stuff out.
Being the first fire that I ever had gone to and be that close to it, I mean, the smoke, you could hear the flames and the stuff burning, snapping and cracking. What the hell am I doing here? But it rubbed off, and I never backed away from another one.
The fire in 1949 burned between 1,300 and 1,500 acres, but the Youngs' house was one of only 2 or 3 homes that were ever in danger. Can you imagine that fire today? It would be a very different story. Hello, I'm Chris Matthews. My wife Kathleen and I have been coming to this island since 1980, and I love living next to the natural beauty of Nantucket Conservation Foundation property. Those of us who live next door to some small part of these 9,000 acres of privately protected open space consider ourselves lucky. But it's easy to forget that our close proximity to Mother Nature also makes us vulnerable to the threat of wildfire.
Just over 50 years ago, a group of people got together with a single mission. How do you preserve the great natural scenic beauty on Nantucket? Well, today, the foundation has over 30% of the island, and this includes some of the most spectacular and iconic properties on Nantucket. As most of you know, we now have houses right up to our properties. And that creates a problem. What's that problem? Is wildfire. The last big fire in my memory was in the 60s. And in those days, we just did not have the proliferation of houses that we do today.
Fire 68 was a fire that started in the Pine Woods, and it was along the Old South Road on the north side. Apparently, I think an old truck or something was driving along, and it was kicking out sparks from a muffler or something dragging, and it just started a series of small fires along the north side of the Old South Road, and it caught those pine trees going. And there hadn't been fires to clear out the brush. It was a lot of brush and a lot of fuel, and that stuff goes up, and it goes up fast.
The first call that they got on it was from the ladies' bowling league that went bowling in the morning. They were just leaving the bowling alley. They went back in, called the station, said, "Hey, you got a fire on Old South Road." Walter Barrett, who was driving the first engine out, said when he pulled up, he says, "Which one do I go to? I can see 5 different fires right now."
I saw it through the eyes of a 5th grader standing on the outside at Academy Hill, and it was just that whole part of the sky was blacked out with smoke.
What we're trying to do is reach out to the community, really educate them on the issue of how all this beautiful property creates a problem in terms of fire. We're also working closely with the fire department.
This stuff is so thick and it's impenetrable, but as we were talking before, with the debris and the branches that have fallen underneath and they've been there for years, and the dry grasses, it burns really hot. It burns hot and fast, and it becomes a problem. I think the most important is the accessibility for fire breaks. If you were going to come in and implement a plan to cut fire breaks in here, so we have accessibility for our equipment. Our equipment's very limited. Perfect example is we have wet areas in there that we can't drive through. We couldn't drive through the scrub oak, so if we want to be able to head a fire off, we just need quick accessibility. We have a couple of 4-wheel drive vehicles designed for that, but there's no vehicle that's designed that can run through this scrub oak. It's like iron, and it tears the undercarriage.
It's brutal on equipment.
Challenges are getting to the fire, sometimes the inaccessibility of the roads, because we have to bring fairly large fire apparatus, just like this, to the location. Not having enough fire breaks to be able to cut off the fire spread, and getting the amount of people and the amount of water that we need in an expedient manner just to be able to extinguish the fire before it can spread into residential properties.
If you own a house, you own a smoke detector. That's the law. You might also own a fire extinguisher. Well, that's called prevention. It makes so much sense we don't question it. A wildfire, by definition, happens under the worst possible circumstances. All this thick underbrush, all this fuel, all this wind, all this dry weather, and all it takes is a spark. So you call the fire department. But here in Nantucket, they face unique challenges. A lot of these brush fires happen in places where lack of municipal water means no fire hydrants. The fire department has to truck water to the fire. Meanwhile, the constant winds here make the situation worse, and if they need help, the closest fire department is, under the best conditions, at least 3 hours away on the mainland. I don't know about you, but to me, when you talk about wildfires, you're talking when and not if. And any firefighter will tell you that preventing a fire is the best way to fight one.
What would be great is to have a continuous plan in place, because the preventative actions, that's constant. So we would survey property, especially starting with properties that are heavily brushed, let's say, near residential areas where there's homes. Survey it, come up with a design for adequate fire breaks to be able to get fire apparatus down to areas where the brush really thickens, and make sure that we clear enough brush away from the residents, as well as have the residential property owners make sure that their roads and their driveways are clear, so we can get fire apparatus down their roads to protect their homes.
We're using computer modeling where we can make estimates as to how long the flames will be and how quickly the fire will spread. And that helps us to identify the places on our properties where it's most likely that we would have wildfire danger close to people's houses.
If you drive out the Pampas Road now, or Old South Road, or Fairgrounds Road, or any of those roads, it's just all full of nice dry fuel. It's all out there.
We'd have lost them. If the houses were as thick as they are today, we'd have lost several houses, the way things are built.
The Nantucket Conservation Foundation is a private, nonprofit group and the largest landowner on the island. But they can't do this alone. To make this plan work, it takes time and money, but more than that, it takes us all to be part of it.
That is the short version of what we've been working on, and what I want to do right now is to jump to some slides that will illustrate some of the issues. While the foundation has been acquiring all of these properties over the last 50 years, as I said earlier, it comes on with a responsibility that we've taken quite seriously. Protecting land is not only maintaining it so that it's not covered with trash and the fences and the signs are in place, but it also requires us to think seriously about the obligations that we have as the stewards of the resources that are occurring on those properties. And we have now a team of year-round scientists working for the foundation, 4 full-time employees whose job it is to inventory what's out on these properties and to make assessments as to what needs to be done to perpetuate those resources. Pretty landscapes, as you see here in the photograph, just don't take care of themselves. And we learned that lesson very early in our history, that to be a proper steward of the property not only makes it welcoming for visitors, but it also makes sure that the rare resources that Nantucket is very much involved with. We're one of the most heavily populated in terms of rare natural resources in the Commonwealth. We're very fortunate to be in that situation, but that comes with a price attached to it. So what we're here to talk about, and these are some of the things that we don't often see because we stay away from these kinds of situations. The whole issue of wildfire. This photograph in the background shows you where Nantucket was back in June of 1949. Some of you were probably around back then and looked out your window one morning and saw the fire out in the state pines, not the one that Harvey Young mentioned, but one of the ones that occurred earlier, 1,300 acres along the Milestone Road and Old South Road. This is a photograph that Bob Buttman his daughter, after listening to me talk to the Hinckley Lane Association a couple of years ago, said my dad had a collection of photographs, and I remember seeing one in that collection of the fire taken from our house on Hinckley Lane. You can imagine the extent of that fire, and this is what we're working hard these days to try and prevent. Wildfire on Nantucket is not something that most people talk about, but we have, from our research and looking at the archives of the Inky Mirror and talking with people, show us that the risk to life and property is very real. One of the things that we became quite concerned about is when you start doing computer modeling of how fast fire can move given the existing fuel loads that we have on Nantucket, we can get flame lengths as high as 72 feet. This is above the top of the existing vegetation. And it can move at a rate of nearly 10 miles an hour. So if you're talking about a fire burning in an area, for example, east of the airport, where there's virtually no separation between the airport and the Tom Nevers West residential area, the area on the west side of Tom Nevers Road, that's a solid mass of, sorry Chris, I don't know what's happening here. It may be hitting the wire, that's why it was making that noise. That area, if a fire started just to the east of the airport, on the Tom Nevers side of the airport, and it was traveling at a rate of 10 miles an hour, it would mean that it would be in Tom Nevers in minutes, not in hours. And so one of the things that you'll see that we've been engaged in doing is trying to figure out what is the best strategy. I mentioned, or the film mentioned, fire breaks, and the foundation has already prepared plans for 3 major blocks of its properties that I'll show you in a second, and we've obtained permits that we required to have from the various agencies, including the State Natural Heritage Program, which is very much on top of making major radical changes to the landscape here on Nantucket because of the existence of rare resources. We've approached them and received permission to cut fire breaks, which will make controlling the fire safer, and it will also make accessing the area of the fire safer for everybody. This is an example seen from the air. That hook-shaped configuration on the ground there is an area on foundation property that was cleared last winter. If you look under the word fire on the second line of the headline there, those are the houses up on North Pasture Lane. This is just south of North Pasture Lane. Topisha Bog, which was once Mariah Mitchell's property, is at the very end of that hook configuration, the fire break that was mowed there last year. This is no small task, and also if you look off in the distance, off to the right of the headline, you'll see the white stripe, the wide white stripe. That's a widening of Pout Pond Road as it heads out toward the Pout Ponds that has been accomplished in the last year. The equipment needed to do that kind of work is significant, as you'll see. It's not this tractor that's shown in this photograph, but we've also obtained the permits necessary for us to do brush cutting in grassy and shrubby areas and also pine tree removal. Sounds like sort of no-brainer stuff that any property owner should be allowed to do on its properties, but again, because of the rare occurrences in plants, animals, insects that occur on Nantucket, we have to be very careful and get the necessary permits. And the state is very much behind this program because not only is it going to be able to break up and reduce the fuel loads that are out there from a fire perspective, but also it's going to be beneficial for many of the resources that occur out there. The other thing that moving ahead we will be doing is to prepare fire plans and obtain the permits necessary for additional prescribed burns to be conducted on the island. several years ago, about 5 years ago, we had an unfortunate escaped fire when we were burning in the Alta Rock Road area, and since then we've taken, the Foundation's board has taken the position that we won't be using staff to do these fire, and it was nobody's fault that it happened. It's just that it would be a safer undertaking in the areas that we are burning as opposed to some of the South Shore areas where there are vast conservation areas that can be easily burned because they're grasslands. The areas that we'd like to burn in are the areas where the accumulated debris, the natural debris from leaves and branches from scrub oak, that dense scrub oak area that Mark was shown walking around in, all that stuff that's accumulated there in the last 50 to 75 years needs at some point to be burned off. Otherwise, it's just going to go from bad to worse. And so what we have been doing is contacting off-island burn crews who work at this 12 months a year, know what they're doing, and when the time is right, when we have finished the fire breaks in certain areas of the island, we will bring those fire professionals to the island for the purpose of reducing the fuel loads. And as I mentioned earlier, it's an action that will also benefit the rare species and habitats that are out there. So I said that there were major areas of Foundation property that we're focused on. One in the southwest corner of the island at the head of the plains, and if you've driven out over Massasoit Bridge in recent times, you'll notice it's very open. A lot of mowing that has gone on there over the years, a lot of past prescribed burning that's been conducted there in an area of grasslands that is not only it looks different. From a landscape perspective, it's a very uncommon landscape that exists on that part of the island, but also it's one of the hot spots for rare resources. It's called a sandplain grassland, which are globally rare. The state, federal agencies are very aware of what's going on out there, and the management practices that have been taking place out there are being perpetuated. So that's not an area that we're starting fresh in. The Middle Moors, about 3,500 acres of Foundation-owned property that's all contiguous acreage, is an area that I'll talk about in a second. And then we have the Matacasham area east of the airport, between the airport and Tom Nevers. Now, the Matacasham area has presented us with some unusual concerns, issues that we have not totally resolved, but are close to getting an understanding from the Corps of Engineers that has been doing a great deal of research out there in the last 5 years or so, looking at the old rocket firing range that had its origins back during World War II when naval aviators from Quonset Point Naval Air Station over in Rhode Island flew to Nantucket to drop practice rounds in this area. On the South Shore, there were 3 targets. The red dots, the large red dots that you see, were targets on the ground, which they were firing at, one of which is already in the water. The middle one is offshore now. And there has been a very intensive aerial survey and ground survey in the last 2 years. About 600 rounds were trucked off the island, material that was found out on the ground. There is work yet to be done, but they have isolated their area of concern into the bright green area on the South Shore there, which is where the concentration of old rockets has been found. We're in the process now of getting an understanding from them of where in this area our wildfire program can get started in, because we have 2 major areas of concern. Right in the middle under that AC 04 is the area called Russell Way. I'm sorry, the strip that comes down from the Milestone Road there, the pink line coming down, heading toward AC4, is Russell Way, but off of that is a group of about 35 homes on Wigwam Road, and they are entirely surrounded by scrub oak, and that's not a good situation. And then also you've got this neighborhood that has developed on the west side of the Tom Nevers Road. still have a hard time imagining that when I first arrived, there was 0 houses there, and now there are about 150 homes on that side of the road. And so at some point soon, we hope, we'll be able to create some wide fire breaks along this side of that development. The reason for that is during the summer months, the prevailing wind is out of the southwest. If somebody were to start a fire down here on the beach in Mattequasham, as has been the case from time to time, bonfires during the summer months seem to be popular pursuits by some of our summer visitors and year-round folks. Start a fire on the beach there that gets into the scrub oak, and it travels rapidly. And guess where it's headed toward? It's headed toward those 150 homes. So we would like very much to have a couple of fire breaks and greater accessibility, which brings me to the Middle Moors area. Lots of lines running around on this plan. The yellow lines are, for the most part, existing roadways that are being widened by our equipment as we speak. They're out there today working on that area. The dotted yellow lines are areas on our property where there are no roads, where we will be creating new ways of getting into those areas. This is the area that I showed you earlier. This is North Pasture Lane, right in here. The homes show in the aerial photograph. The purple area is an area that will eventually be burned off, but this dotted road is the road that has been opened up in the last year, and it will continue along through the Shakamo Hills and come out and connect with the existing road system. The middle of the island, the gray area there, has previously been burned, and it's our expectation that that will continue. The green blobs are areas of pine growth, and unfortunately, pitch pine, which is the dominant species out there, spreads by wind dispersion. The seeds blow out of the cones, they spread off, and like fire, they spread in the general direction that the wind is blowing. So during the summer months when their pine cones are open and letting go of the accumulated seeds in those cones, that seed supply blows off towards the northeast with the southwest wind, and that's spreading slowly out into the Middle Moors. So we're trying to put that to, halt that action. The problem with the pine trees is when they catch fire, they candle. The top of the tree bursts into flame, and material drifts off from the head of that fire and ignites new fires, spot fires in other areas. So we're trying to contain that. Serengeti, the orange area down in the lower central portion of the photograph here, you're familiar with driving along the Milestone Road. That will continue to be mowed as it is, which means that the chances of a fire spreading there are not great. The purple areas have, along near the Cranberry Bog, there's been some major mowing in that area. So it's a concerted effort. The red line is the extent of the foundation's property. So you can see that most of that central moorland area will, at one point or another, once these fire breaks are created, it would be our hope that that's where the prescribed burning would take place, that accumulated organic debris that's on the ground there would be burned off. Now, how do we get to these areas? One of the decisions that we had to make early on was, with the budget that we had available, what could we do? And the answer to that was not much. And so about a year and a half ago, we started a fundraising effort, and fortunately we're able to accumulate in a fairly short period enough money to go out and buy this piece of equipment. It is not commonly seen on the island because where it works are places where people don't usually go. I'm going to show you a short video clip in a minute or two as to what this piece of equipment called a Fecon does, but in the still photographs, you can see on the ground there the accumulated mulched material. This is, for the most part, material that was generated by cutting through shrubby areas. This is what it does to a scrub oak tree, and that the diameter at the base of that tree, you can see sort of an arc there. That's the stump of the tree left on the ground, but that is the remains of a tree that was about 10 inches in diameter. We've experimented with lots of equipment back when we started the Serengeti mowing, now about 18 years ago. It's hard to believe that that started that long ago. We used the very primitive brush cutting equipment that was available on the island. We actually called in under contract a company that had a machine which they were raving about, said, oh, this machine which we refer to as the Brontosaurus will come to Nantucket and make short work of clearing off the scrub oak. It was a boom-mounted big backhoe with a brush cutting machine on the front of it, and the contractor came in, spent 5 days. We said, we'll pay you to come to the island and spend 5 days here and see what you accomplish. And it was about 3.5 days into his experiment on the island that he said, you know, I'm just going to pack my equipment up and go home. I can't cut scrub oak. And what was happening is that he'd come down on top of the tree with this brush cutting machine, and it would start bouncing off the trunk of the tree. The scrub oak grows so slowly that the cells of that plant are like steel. And it is an unusual piece of equipment that can handle that kind of wood. And so we had to go to the forestry supply people who supply large forest operations all across the world, and say, what is it that you people use to clear your roads before you go in there with your equipment? And they all pointed us to the Fecon. Now, the Fecon is a piece of equipment that most people would never come in contact with. As I said, it cost a lot. It cost us about $250,000 to buy that piece of equipment. We have expectations that we would like to raise between $100,000 and $250,000 a year for this program. Get back there. And obviously, as time goes on, when we get into the maintenance phase, we figure that there are probably 7 to 8 years worth of very hard work ahead of us. We've been through year 1. We probably have 7 years ahead of us in order to create the fire breaks and create the perimeters so that we can go out and do the prescribed burns that we would like to accomplish. After that, it may be once the land has been cleared, like the Serengeti, it's a fairly easy task to go out there on an annual basis and mow it, or to do a prescribed burn in a fairly open area. We look to not only the community, but also the organizations within the community to help us raise these monies. It's a special fund that the foundation has that we encourage people who support the foundation's work to make their tax-deductible gifts to. We go out to the neighborhood associations. One of my board members, David Ross, and I have been out to about 15 such gatherings in the last year, trying to get people to understand what it is we're doing, how it benefits them as next-door neighbors to our properties, but it's also the entire island that would benefit. Go back in your mind to that photograph I showed you of the fire that occurred back in the 40s. It would be a pretty frightening thing to live anywhere on the island and see a column of smoke like that going on for days. Not to mention air quality, not to mention the comings and goings of additional fire equipment. I mean, it's a pretty frightening situation. And if that were to occur in the middle of our summer season, you can imagine what that would do to tourism on Nantucket. We have all, in recent years, read about the experiences out in the west of these small communities that have had devastating fires and what it's done to their local economies. That's something we certainly don't want to see ever happen here on the island. What can we do? What can we individually do? Mark keeps reminding us that if you ever see something that looks suspicious in the way of a fire, don't get in your car and go looking for it. Call 911. That's where we all start. Leave it to the fire professionals. They know how to deal with it, and the sooner that they hear about it, the more likely it is that they'll be able to put it under control. Be extremely careful when you use fire around the house, whether it's a gas grill in the backyard or whatever, birthday candles on a cake on the back deck. Be aware of what damage could be done if it got away from you. And protect your home and your property. I've got copies of the brochure that we worked with the fire department in producing about 18 months ago, how to protect yourself, your property in Nantucket from wildfire. There are lots of very helpful suggestions in that. It'll give you an illustration of how, if you own a property on the island, how to maintain your property, how to try and clear back a safe distance from the edge of your home, and other useful pieces of information. The foundation has worked hard for 50 years, and this is just the beginning of it. When you own property forever, you have a huge responsibility, not only to the property, but also to the community. And we take that on very seriously. We want people to enjoy our lands. We want them, for those who live next door to our properties, to feel safe, but we also need to have responsible next door neighbors so that they're not out there lighting fires, or their children aren't out there firing firecrackers out into the scrub oak on the 4th of July, as typically happens during the summer season. Those are things that we cope with. I want to show you just a brief 1-minute video of the Fecon in action. Oh, that's right, we're back on the... This is quite a piece of equipment. I did not, as many times as I've seen videos of it in action, it's something like standing next to it. It is it'll make its statement here in a second. There we go. The first video is of it in shrubby material, pretty much what is found. It doesn't hesitate, it just moves. There's a family on this. Now this is in larger material, and this is one of those tall scrub oaks that the other machine just bounced off the top of. And you'll see it come down on the trunk of the tree. That is the end of the visual presentation, and all I want to do is leave you with that fire, as the chief will say, is something that we try and prepare ourselves for. You heard Chris Matthews in the video that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Fire will happen. What we are trying to do and have committed ourselves to do for many years to come is to try and minimize the risks of those fires, not only by doing things on our properties, but also by talking to groups like this, by talking to users of our properties on a one-on-one basis, and to encourage them to be responsible when they go out on our properties, when they drive down a road out in the middle moors, not to be flicking their cigarette butts out into the edge of the road where the possibility exists that it will catch fire, and fire will spread without people realizing it. We had Alan Reinhardt is our seasonal moorlands ranger, and we've had many experiences where the morning after a party, I'll be Christian about it, out in the moors when high schoolers, college kids get together to have a couple of cans of beer and a little bonfire in the middle of the evening hours. My classic example is that we got a call in the office at about 8 o'clock the next morning. The first plane flying in from Hyannis with the newspapers spotted a smoldering fire out in the middle moors, and in responding to that, it turned out it was a sofa that somebody had trucked out there, and this was part of their seating for the party the night before. They had left a bonfire. The fire started dwindling, but sparks from the fire got over to the sofa. The sofa caught fire. It smoldered there for hours until it was reported to us, and the fire department went out and extinguished it. That's not the first time, the last time that things like that happen. But again, you can imagine during the summer months with that wonderful summer breeze that we have here present most of the time, a fire starting someplace down on the South Shore that is left without being extinguished. Sparks from that come inland, catch into the scrub oak, and start off towards Tom Nevers or towards Nantucket or where have you. So these are all serious situations. If you all have any questions, be happy to respond. Mark McDougall, our fire chief, is here. If you have any questions for him, fire away. No pun intended. Chris.
When you make these fire breaks with machine or whatever other means you have, how far down do you have to take it? And with the debris that is created by the machine, do you come in and gather that up? Or?
The debris is left to dry out. Now, ultimately, it will provide us with another reason to get in there with prescribed fire. It would carry a fire. Part of the science of prescribed fires is to ensure that you have enough fuel on the ground to be able to move that fire along. You don't want it to burn rapidly, which it does when it gets into a high shrub or into a low tree like the pitch pines. The width of the fire breaks are all dependent on the adjoining fuel. So in the case of scrub oak, typically we would be cutting at least 75 feet wide, maybe 150 feet wide, because we want a safe distance between where the firefighters and their equipment are standing. If a fire is approaching you, you want to have a safe distance between you and it, a place that you can defend, that you can keep wet, and keep your equipment and your personnel away from. You don't want them to be fighting a fire right on the edge of tall scrub oak. So we're taking the roads and opening the width on either side of the road to probably, at this point, they're about 50 feet wide. We'll take those out wider to about 75 feet. And these large fire breaks, because we don't know what direction the fire would be coming from, we're trying to take those out to 150 feet wide. In fact, some of the fuel conditions on Nantucket suggest that fire breaks should be as wide as 300 feet. You can imagine the impact on the landscape if everywhere you went on the island you had a 300-foot mowed strip. There wouldn't be much left behind to be looking at. So we're using our discretion in some places, but the example that I showed you, the aerial view of the area next to North Pasture Lane, that's now about 150 feet wide. So if they had a fire coming toward them from the south, at least there would be a defensible area there. It's not only about not allowing an area, because if you have everything mowed down to the ground, obviously the fire is going to creep along the ground there, and it'll be easier to control than something that is burning in a 12-foot tall mass of scrub oak. But you also need to consider that this is about human safety besides property safety. It's people who are out there, the professionals that are out there fighting the fire. That's our highest priority. We want to keep them safe, and we also want to create opportunities for their equipment to be able to get to the scene of the fire, which means if you drive along the Pout Pond Road today, you'll see a break where there never used to be a break and a fence where there never used to be a fence, because we don't want the four-wheel drive traffic to get back in there and start tearing the place apart. So it's a balancing act and getting people to understand that there are places that they're certainly welcome to walk in those areas, but we don't want the four-wheelers back in those sites. Gene, do you have a question? No? Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming this afternoon. Hopefully tomorrow morning it'll be more than 16 degrees. And we'll all see you at the beach this summer. Thank you. I've brought other publications that relate to not only fire but the foundation. There are copies of the foundation's property map, some materials about our science program for those of you who are interested, and everybody always likes stickers, so I brought stickers too. Thanks again for coming.